The great Roman poet Juvenal once wrote in his sixth satire, Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who watches the watchers themselves, is one way to translate that. And you can see from these words, custodiet and custodes, gives us our modern word custodian, not necessarily the person that cleans the school, but someone who cares for something, someone who watches something. So one translation of that is watchman. Now, in juvenile satire, it is about the politics of watching, the politics of keeping someone kind of sequestered, who gets knowledge, who doesn't, who gets to make decisions about the people that watch over us, whether that's government, whether that's just how is power distributed. And that's something that really interested Juvenal, obviously something that interests Alan Moore as well in this novel. So the Watchmen come to stand for these group of superheroes, and we have to take that with a kind of grain of salt because there really is only one superhero among them, and that's Dr. Manhattan, John Osterman. The other heroes, except maybe Ozymandias, as you'll see when we get to the end of the novel, are normal people who just train and kind of achieve superhuman feats through kind of honing their bodies and those sorts of things. So the dramatis personae, the cast of characters. Here on the left we have Ozymandias, also known as Adrian Veidt. Here we have Silk Spectre II, Laurie Jupezek, or Laurie Jupiter. We have Dr. Manhattan, also known as John Osterman. We have Night Owl II, Dan Dryberg. We have Rorschach's Walter Kovacs, and the comedian Edward Blake. Now, the comedian is dead at the very beginning of the novel. We learn how that happens later on. You also notice that some of these characters have twos after their names because they're the second in a lineage. So Laurie Jupezek, Silk Spectre II, her mother, Sally Jupiter, or Sally Jupezek, was the first Silk Spectre, and then as Laurie grew up, she took over her mom's costume and her name. And then here, Dan Dryberg takes over Night Owl from a guy named Hollis Mason, who writes Under the Hood, which is a novel all about the superhero activities, the mass vigilantes, and the group that Hollis Mason was a part of. So these are the major characters that we're going to see throughout the novel. And we, of course, start with Rorschach. Rorschach is a character that gets a lot of exploration in the novel. He is a right-wing person who has a lot of anti-government, anti-PC values. And very troublingly, I think, for a lot of people, too, is by the time we get to the end of the novel really asks about whether or not Rorschach is the moral center of it, which I think is part of the novel's critique of superheroes more generally. But these are the major characters, and it's useful to kind of get yourself familiar with them at the beginning. You'll notice that they are not characters you are familiar with necessarily. You may have seen the Schneider version of Watchmen. That movie came out, I think, in 2006, or you may have put it out of your mind, like Batman versus Superman. I don't think it's as bad of a movie as people say it is, but it's definitely not great. Or you may know the HBO series that came out, the brilliant HBO series. Adrian Veidt is still a character in that. So is Laurie. They're obviously older now, but they're still characters in that you may recognize. And one of the reasons you don't recognize them is because they're actually adapted from Charlton Comics characters. Now, Charlton Comics was a kind of very minor comics producing company that existed from 45 to 86, although in 83 they sold off most of their intellectual property from their superhero lines to DC. And basically, each of the characters in Watchmen has a kind of analog, an obvious analog in the DC universe. But my understanding is that Alan Moore wanted to use Batman and Superman and things like that, but you can see from the very first page of Watchmen why DC editors would not want him to do that. Rorschach seems to me to be clearly a version of Batman, and you can't have Batman saying the things that Rorschach says. You can't have Superman, which seems to me an obvious analog of Dr. Manhattan, detached from humanity, unwilling to help the world that he's taking on as his own. That's very much not in Superman's ethos. So what Alan Moore did is says, okay, well, you have these Charlton Comics characters. I'm going to adapt them for what I want to do. So this guy over here on the right was The Question, came out in 1967. He had this kind of mask that masked his identity, and that seems to me clearly to be the influence of Rorschach. So each of those characters has a different analog or antecedent in Charlton Comics, although Alan Moore really makes him his own. There's a character called the Blue Beetle that becomes Night Owl. There's a character called Atomic Man, I think, that becomes Dr. Manhattan. So that's where many of these characters come from and why you don't recognize them. Another aspect of the novel's characterization is what critic Ian Thompson calls hypertrophic deconstruction. Now, those are two long words, and if it's easier, you don't have to remember them. But the idea is encapsulated in this little quote here, that what Alan Moore is able to do is to deconstruct his hero by developing it to its absolute limits, right? So you take these traditional hero fantasies, as he says, or tropes, or qualities, or types, and you push them to their absolute extreme, and it kind of explodes the whole thing, right? So if you take, for example, something like Dr. Manhattan, who is this kind of idea of science. He's an idea within comic books that they have this fascination with technology, with science and what it can do. A lot of comics are preoccupied, as you see from Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, with nuclear power. When you take that kind of idea about the potential of science and push it to its extreme, you get somebody like Dr. Manhattan, who on the one hand, I'll go forward, symbolizes the ability of the scientific ability to master matter, to see time and space differently, to innovate all of these new technologies through his relationship with Adrian Veidt and Pyramid Technologies, or Pyramid Corporation, I think it's called. He basically is able to make free energy. They make cigarettes that don't give you cancer, those sorts of things. But he can't understand human beings, right? So part of what Moore does is say, okay, well, let's take this basic idea, like the deification of science, or making science into something like a God figure. But what would be the bad part of that? If you could see everything on a molecular level, you could see past, present, and future at the same time, it would be really hard, I think, to actually still understand humans, and the novel explores that. We get a different version of that in Rorschach, right? So the very first page lets you know that this is a guy who's got an atypical worldview. We get this diegetic narration of his version of things. His cadence and his word choice is very distinctive of him. This is, if you watch old noir detective movies, read old noir detective comic books or novels, this is what you get more or less, is this kind of detective, this kind of worldview that Moore is just pushing to its absolute limit and saying, what if this guy was real, or if this Batman type, right? And Batman takes a lot of his early influence from these same sources, these noir detective sources, and pushed it to his extreme. You would get this kind of crazed vigilante whose politics is really troubling, right? Who's got this inflexible moral code and has something really close to a kind of fascist view of others and of society, and certainly seems offensive to many of our 21st century sensibilities. So I think this is a tactic that Moore and Gibbons use through each of the characters, and you can think about other characters doing similar things, like Night Owl. His fascination with technology is also reminiscent of Batman, of course. But he says that he becomes a crime fighter because he watched The Sword and the Stone too many times, right? He's really interested in the Knights of the Round Table, and that kind of, how do you have that kind of adolescent fantasy with the Knights of the Round Table, and you take that kind of too far? That's one way to understand that character. So as you go through the novel, I'd encourage you to think about what's at the core of each of these characters, and what's Moore trying to kind of explode and think through those characters and the problems they would encounter in the real world. The timeline can be a bit confusing to folks. The Watchmen as a novel is called speculative fiction. It's grouped together often with sci-fi and fantasy. All that really means is that it postulates that there's a world that's different from ours in some fundamental ways, right? So this novel opens in 1996. Nixon has been president 4 times. They got rid of term limits in the novel. The U.S. wins the Vietnam War, and there's free, clean energy. And all of these differences between our world and them, and the world of Watchmen, becomes really important for how the novel understands its world and structures its conflicts and things like that. So 1939 is when the U.S. is just starting to get involved in World War II. They're about ramping up to get involved in World War II. The Minutemen are formed, and that is the earliest crime-fighting organization in New York, in the United States, we're meant to think. And this is when a lot of the first generation of superheroes comes out. And 1939 is, of course, also when the first Superman comic is published in our world, in the real world. They disband in 1949. John Osterman becomes Dr. Manhattan in 1959. 1966, Ozymandias, who's younger than a lot of the first generation of crime fighters, he convenes what he calls the Crime Busters. Very short-lived. It doesn't have a lot of success, partially because the comedian won't buy in. You'll read about that. 1977, the Keene Act outlaws mass vigilantes. A few are still allowed to operate, such as the comedian, because he's, as the novel says, quote, overthrowing Marxist regimes in South and Central America. So he's kind of a government employee, even though he's a despicable human. And Rorschach still continues to function. He just functions outside of the law. But most of the other people by this point, by 1977, have kind of abandoned their crime-fighting ways. Hollis Mason, for example, writes a book called Under the Hood, all about the Minutemen Crime Busters. So he kind of comes out and says, I was the first Night Owl. Ozymandias releases his identity, but a lot of the other people's don't, right? So the Jupesics, Blake, and Rorschach, all of those characters keep their real identity hidden. And then when you get to 1986, it's the opening of Watchmen. And then here's a little timeline there too, if you want to check that out. Although it incorporates details from the HBO series, just FYI. But after you read Watchmen, you should definitely go watch the HBO series because it's great. And one of the last things I want to say about Watchmen is that when it came out in 1986, one of the things that Alan Moore said, was that he wanted to create a graphic novel that could not be adapted into film. Now, of course, people have tried that with various degrees of success. But one of the ways that he tried to create a graphic novel that couldn't be remediated into a new medium was to really test the formal limits of comics. And what I mean by that is what the form could do that a different form could not do. So, for example, the one chapter, Fearful Symmetry, which takes its title from a William Blake poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. When you get to the absolute center of that novel, or that chapter, you get this X figure that spans between the two pages. And if you look, there's the exact same panel configuration on either sides of it. So it's almost like this line becomes a mirror. And if you turn these two pages, collapse them onto each other, you'll see the page that follows this one and the page that precedes this one also have an exact mirroring of the panel structure. And they do it, and he does it also with colors and things within this particular chapter. It's a really brilliant way of kind of saying, here's something that comics does that no other form can do because of the panel structure, because of the reading experience. So that's not the only way he does that. For example, when Dr. Manhattan goes to Mars and he's kind of going back and forth in time through his memory and also through his ability to move through time, the graphic novel, I think, tries to recreate that because our eyes can move between panels on the page in a way that's kind of like leaping forward and backwards in time too. So that's another thing you might think of as you're reading this, is how is Moore using the comic book medium in very intentional ways that maybe had not been done before. So this is just a little intro. I'll make another video about some more kind of questions you might chase down, but get in touch if you have any comments or questions, and really enjoy this. It's a novel that is well received. Obviously, it's 35 years old now, so it's had a lot of influence within the medium and within culture more generally. So enjoy the reading, and look forward to the next video.